Good morning and welcome to the second webinar organized by TU Delft Safety and Security Institute. Before we start, I need to make sure that everybody can hear me. Could one of the attendees please respond using the chat function or the question function to let us know that you can hear us? Just to ensure that the sound is up and running. Yes, very good. Yes, we can hear you. Excellent. So welcome to the second webinar on the post-lockdown situation, the coming up post-lockdown situation that we are heading for. My name is Behnam Taebi. I am the Scientific Director of the TU Delft Safety and Security Institute and your host today for this webinar. Today we have with us two TU Delft professors, Professor Rob Kooij and Professor Tina Comas, who will speak with us on the upcoming post-lockdown situation, the post-lockdown society, the challenges of social and mathematical predictions. A lot of what is happening nowadays is in terms of anticipating what is going to happen after the lockdown is going to be loosened slightly or more rigorously, and what are the consequences and to what extent can we predict those consequences, because we need to make policy on those predictions. So that is a challenge that could best be understood from the perspective of both mathematical predictions, but also understanding the societal settings of those predictions. And that would be the focus of our webinar today. Before we start, I want to announce that there is the possibility of asking questions. Some of you have already used the question section to let me know that you can hear us. You can make use of the question section to ask questions. Please ask your questions as brief and short as possible. We will try to attend to as many as possible of those questions during the webinar. I will collect them and select a few and ask the speakers. And all the questions, the full list of questions will be shared with the speakers afterwards. Let me see. Yes, the questions. The session will be as follows. We will have a 15 minutes talk by Rob Kooij, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Tina Comas will have another 15 minutes of talk, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and we will wrap up with a final 15 minutes of question and answers between, again, you and both speakers. And again, during the whole session, the question section will be open with a request to keep the questions as brief as possible and to the point such that I could reproduce the question to the speaker. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Rob Kooij and give him the floor for the first talk of today on the mathematical predictions. Professor Kooij, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can also see my screen.
Yes.
So then I think we're all set. So what I would like to talk about in this upcoming 15 minutes is the mathematical aspect of predicting the future post-lockdown. So I will mainly talk about mathematics. I'm a mathematician myself. I'm a full professor at the Faculty of Electrical Engineering, Mathematics and Computer Science. And I'm working in a section called Network Architectures and Services. So my interest as a mathematician is in networks. Now let us see how that comes in handy in predicting what's going to happen in this crisis. I would like to start with a simple question. This is actually my first webinar. Normally when I give a talk, I seek a lot of interaction. It's a bit complicated to do that today, but still I'd like to ask a question to all of you in the audience. Do you know who this guy is? You can think about it a little bit. You don't have to respond actually, but just think a little bit. Who could this gentleman be? Okay, so in fact, he is a professor in the Imperial College in London. He's called Neil Ferguson. And he used to be scientific advisor to the UK government until the beginning of this month, advising the government on what policy steps to take in fighting the virus pandemic. And in fact, he wrote a very influential report that was published on the 16th of March 2020. So this was a report written by a team consisting mainly of researchers of Imperial College, but also people from WHO were involved. And you see a long list of authors over here. And basically what they did, based upon mathematical models, they predicted that if the UK government, and I hope that you remember that in the beginning of March, Boris Johnson said, okay, we're going for herd immunity. We're not going to do that many things to fight this virus. We're just going to let it spread in a natural way until enough people are immune. And then this report, again, based on mathematical modeling, predicted if he would follow this route, if he would not take more severe action, 500,000 people would die in a matter of months. So this example shows that this crisis really puts mathematics in the spotlight. And that's not only because we see the clear impact on policy and policy decision making, but also, for instance, if you go to your regular websites, your regular news websites, you see all this terminology that comes from mathematics, like exponential growth, moving averages, a mythical number called R naught, flattening the curve, the R number, etc. So this crisis really also brings mathematics in the spotlight. Now, of course, people that are using mathematics to predict what will happen in the future use very complicated models. And I don't have time to go into all the gory details of these complicated models, but I will give you the basic principles. So the basic principles, they always look at the situation where people can be in one of three states. Or sometimes these states are called compartments, and they call these models compartmental models. So either you're susceptible, that means you didn't catch the virus yet, the disease yet. That means you could become infected by being in contact with so-called infected people, or to make it more precise, infectious people. And after a while, either you're healed, either you're cured, or you could die from the disease. So basically we have three compartments here. Susceptible will be denoted by S, infected denoted by I, or removed. Sometimes people say R is recovered, but actually it's removed. We also assume, by the way, that once you are removed, you are immune to catching the disease again. Then basically we use two approaches. The first one is called agent-based modeling. So principally every human is more or less modeled as an agent following some, let's say, simple rules, like the way they move or how often they go outside, things like that, the type of behavior that comes with this person. And then you put all these agents together following these rules, and then it's relatively easy, at least at a small scale, to predict what will happen in the future based upon simulations of these agent-based models. The second approach, there you look at whole groups of people, and you derive so-called differential equations. So that says something about the evolution over time of these populations, which are either susceptible, infected, or removed. And then by using the proper equations, you can write down the whole system of differential equations. And you can use data to make estimations for the parameters involved. I'm not going to dwell on what these parameters mean in this case. But the trick here is, how do I estimate proper values of the parameters? And for this, you need to have a lot of data. So what I'm going to show you now is two examples of simulations based on either agent-based models or equation-based models that give us all insight in the future of the prevalence of the virus. So there's a lot of very nice simulators out there. The first one that I found was one called Corona Simulator, which was shared by the Washington Post. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting to have. I also want to play with that, but it didn't come with any code. So I started looking a little bit on the internet, and in fact, I found a postdoc at the Faculty of Civil Engineering called Paul van Gent, who more or less built his own simulator based on Python. Well, I happen to be proficient in Python, so I could also play a little bit with it. And let me share with you one of his videos. So again, this is just a toy model. It's not very realistic, but at least it gives you an impression based on a simple agent-based model what the future might look like. So let's look at his video. So basically what he did, he has 2,000 people in this square. They're moving according to certain rules of this SIR model. So people, if they bump into each other, they might infect each other. And what you see in the below is the number of infected people, and the horizontal line that you see is the IC capacity. So that's the number of beds in the intensive care unit. So this is just an example of a simple simulation. But you can see immediately from this type of simulation what will happen in the near future. And again, it's not extremely accurate, of course, but at least it gives you a good feeling in the order of number of people that might be infected, and in this specific case, also the number of people that might die. So this is based on agent-based modeling. Now, in fact, the second type of approach is based on these equations, on ordinary differential equations. Actually, the model that I showed, the SIR model, is rather simple to implement. And also of these type of simulators, many are available on the internet. The link that you see over here, ncase.me/COVID-19, is a very nice site that explains you all the details of the equation-based models. So let us look at this simulator as well. What you see denoted here is the number of infected persons in this community. It's the red curve, and the gray curve is the number of recovered. Yeah. So the interesting thing is that the people who prepare advice for the government are all using these type of simulators, either equation-based, maybe agent-based modeling based, or combinations of those. So in fact, the report that was published by Imperial College on the 16th of March was report 9. A couple of months later, the same group around Neil Ferguson came up with another report. And this is the first report where they started to look at the post-lockdown situation. So what they did, they used a combination of agent-based models and also the equation-based models, and look at the scenario where some of the measures that are part of the lockdown would be relaxed. And what they looked at specifically is the situation where people start to be more mobile. I'll get back to that later. But in this model, and in fact, this is something that I read in many papers that are now occurring, most of the time still preprints. In the current models, they do not take into account cross-region movement. So they basically look at one region, for instance, that could be Lombardy in Italy, and they just look at what's happening inside this province. They do not look at the impact of people moving from one province to the other province. Yeah? So it's, in a sense, it's a homogeneous model. Yeah? So it's still simplifying something. Now, for this reason, in our group, in our Network Architectures and Services group, NAS, we decided to use the same type of equation-based model, but now apply it on a network, in a network setting. So what do you get? So, for instance, we study the prevalence of the virus in the Netherlands, but we don't look at the whole Netherlands as a whole, but we look at it as a combination of nodes. Yeah, so we're going to form a network here, and each node is formed by a province. And of course, all these provinces are connected. Why are they connected? Because people can travel from one province to the other. I mean, you can even travel from Friesland all the way to Limburg by train or by car. So we are basically looking at this specific network, and we look at the prevalence of the network, how it spreads both within the nodes, within the provinces, but also between the provinces. And of course, we use the data that is available from a lot of websites like RIVM, but we don't know the actual parameters that are involved. And in fact, if you only look at one node, you only need like 2 or 3 parameters. Please remember the SIR model that I introduced. But now we have 12 provinces, so we need many more parameters to estimate. And we have designed an algorithm called Network Inference-Based Prediction Algorithm to estimate these parameters. And that works pretty well. And here you see an example where we, for 5 provinces, we use the data to build our model, and then for the next 4 days, we make the estimates. And in this case, you can see that the estimates are pretty good, with the exception of North Brabant, which by that time still was the province with the most infected people. Now, we also use this so-called NIPA model to evaluate exit strategies. And I'm going to show you a picture of that. It's a bit sketchy. So first of all, on the left, you see the situation where there were no measures in place yet. So the virus was already here, but the number of infections did not go yet. Infected people did not go yet in the exponential phase. Then you see the lockdown process. So what are you actually looking at? Well, basically, you see 12 different figures, graphs, and each graph is the fraction of infected people in that province. Yeah? So it's scaled to the number of the population of each country. And the dotted line, that's the average over the whole Netherlands. Now you see that this is the let's say the pink area. After a while, let's say here time step 65, 64, we start the exit process. So we start to relax some of the measures that are part of the lockdown. And in this specific simulation, we opened up only one province. I think we opened up the South Holland. And then you see immediately what the impact is. And the nice thing of this model is that, I mean, you can see the impact on the whole country, but also on the level of the individual provinces. Yeah? I'll get back to that later, why this is relevant. So, exit strategies, I already mentioned it. So what does it actually mean? Well, it basically means that we are looking at the relaxation of the measures that are part of the lockdown that will be applied post-lockdown. So you have to say something about public gatherings, 100 people, 20 people, 10 people. What about schools and universities, closing, opening, and in what way? Social distancing measures, mobility restrictions, case-based measures, etc. Now, in effect, an explicit exit strategy is a combination of, well, which measures do I choose from this list? And also when does it start? When does it end? And also where? Also only in one province, only in South Holland, or in a couple of provinces, or all at the same time? And also, is there a restriction with respect to the people that have to adhere or not adhere to these measures? Maybe vulnerable age groups and stuff like that. So in fact, if you want to model all of this, it's quite a complicated combination of a lot of things, both in time and in space. And you also have to look at adherence. So of course, with these exit strategies comes a lot of uncertainty, because as I mentioned, we need a lot of data, and the data is not always available. The quality is not always optimal. From the epidemiological point of view, we don't even know yet for sure if people that have recovered from COVID-19 are immune. So we don't know that yet. Seasonal variation is another unknown. Also the number of undetected cases. So for instance, if you look at this very simple SIR model, we don't take into account undetected cases. So that has also been taken care of. As soon as we go to the post-lockdown, we have to take human mobility into account, obviously, because human mobility is the main reason for contact between people and thus for transmission of the virus. And also, even if we come up with a set of measures, and even if we understand what it would mean for human mobility, will people adhere to these measures, and for how long, and to what extent? So these are all unknowns. Now, coming back again to our friend Neil Ferguson, he presented his report 4th of May looking at the impact of relaxation on mobility restrictions in Italy. So he used Google Analytics, Google mobility data, and then using his models, again, much more complicated than the SIR model that I showed. For one of the regions that he studied, Piedmont, he came up with this prediction, which obviously has a whole bandwidth of predictions because there's a lot of uncertainty, and he deals with it by taking randomness into account and the sensitivity analysis. And you can clearly see that if you assume that 40%, we assume a 40% return to pre-lockdown mobility levels, we have a huge second wave coming. Yeah? I should also mention that by this time, 4th of May 2020, it became known that Ferguson himself also was infected. One of his visits to Downing Street, he got infected, and then later on, when the lockdown was in place, he invited his mistress to his house, and then he decided to resign from the strategic advisory board to the government. So you see, this is also an example of a human factor in this story. Okay. So one way of dealing with the uncertainty in mobility is looking at all types of data that are easily available. So some of our colleagues from the Faculty of Civil Engineering, that's Panchami Krishna and Odette Katz, have done a very nice study. They looked at smart card data from a metro users in Washington, D.C. And they found, if you go back to pre-corona demand, that even 3 infectious travelers in the morning rush hour can infect more than half of all the travelers in just like 3 weeks. So this is the same message as you've seen in the previous slide. If we open up everything and we don't think and we don't adhere to measures, we're really gonna get a serious second wave. Okay, so where does that leave me? So we think that in order to quantify the impact of the exit strategies, we need to combine a couple of approaches. So we need epidemiology and network knowledge. So that's represented in NIPA. We have to use the knowledge and the experience and the data from the people working on mobility. So these are the people from civil engineering that I mentioned before. But we also need, and that's a very important factor in this study as well, we have to understand what people will do. And this is in fact the topic of the second speaker of this webinar. This was my final slide, Behnam.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for the excellent presentation. I have just one announcement before we move on to the Q&A section. Dr. Paul van Gent's presentation simulation was included in Rob's presentation. And I can just want to announce that a link to his website, including the simulation, will be on the website of Delft, TU Delft Safety and Security Institute after the webinar. So you could also reach out to him if you have any questions or you want to know more about the model presented.
Excellent.
One quick question regarding the models that you're presenting, and to what extent you could use these models for anticipation and predicting future behavior. A lot of these models are including actually certain assumptions, and one of those assumptions, and I was curious how that the model accounts for this assumption, is that certain rules are put in place and the rules will be acted upon, especially when we're dealing not with actual real-time data, or not real-time per se, but with actual data, and we're trying to anticipate. We need to make an assumption regarding compliance with certain regulations, etc. And if we just look outside our windows, we can see that the social distancing, or the way that the WHO was insisting on calling it physical distancing, is not really being complied with at this moment. So when dealing with anticipating future behavior, anticipating coming out of the lockdown, to what extent does the model anticipate perfect agent behavior? Or are we also assuming that some people might not be in compliance and might not act upon the rules?
Okay, that's a very good question. So in our group, so far, we are basically looking at the equation-based approach. And the interesting thing is, I've shown you a very simple model, right? With only 2 parameters, if you remember well, a beta and a gamma. And the beta is simply, let's say, the contact rate, and the gamma is more or less the removal rate. And again, the removal either means you cure or you die. But in all the models I've seen so far, taking into account the measures is simply multiplying in a linear way, yes, indeed, a linear way, the parameter beta. So that's, for the time being, that is extremely simple, right? So what I think that we should do is we should combine these equation-based models with agent-based models, and somehow, well, make this much more, make this function, this transfer function from, let's say, measures to behavior, well, much more complicated or much more realistic. So what you can still use, of course, just linear functions to make estimates, but then it's extremely crude and extremely worst case probably. So what I could say, okay, you know, I assume that only 5% of the people adhere to these measures, but then it will probably be a very worst case estimate. It's still useful. So I mean, complexity starts to play a big role very soon in these models.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think
they
that would
also
also
have to
be
deal with that. So in fact, the reason, I mean, the reason that we want to bring up this escape project, which we submitted last week, by the way, is actually, I think we really need to bring together these types of expertise, because otherwise predictions are, well, will be extremely hard. It's already extremely hard, but not bringing together the different disciplines, then you're definitely not going to make a mark, I think.
Another question, let's attend to the questions coming in from the attendees. A question coming in regarding your prediction. So how would your predictions actually compare to other prediction models? Are you arriving at different conclusions than other models right now available? And that's specifically a question about slide number 10.
Let me go back. I'm still sharing, right?
Yes.
Okay, so at the moment we are finishing a paper. This is just something that we put on the website because we update it every day. And we are also making, in this paper, we're also making comparisons with other models. The thing is, of course, that most other models don't take the network perspective. So really like 99.9% of the papers that I see, and I see a lot of papers, they come in every day, they don't look at the network perspective. So they look at, let's say, the Netherlands as a whole. Yeah? So in order to compare, we also have to implement their models. Right? So it takes a while to implement it, but so far we are one of the very few models that looks at this network perspective.
Yeah. And another question, maybe good to stick to this slide, coming about the NEPA model. The question is that accounting for, is that looking at the fact that distribution across the provinces is also very much skewed?
I didn't get the last bit, sorry.
Whether it accounts for the fact that distribution across provinces is skewed. So the distribution across...
yeah, sure. Well, the interesting is that comes out of the model. So we, a priori, we don't make any assumptions on the actual network, on the actual connection network. We just assume that there could be a connection between every province. But of course, if you're going to compare infection rates between Friesland in the north and Limburg in the south, the data will show you that it's very low. But you don't have to know that a priori, which is interesting. So the model gives it to you in combination with the data. So yeah, the answer is yes, it's very skewed.
Another question coming in regarding actually the reliability and trustworthiness of the model, and to what extent could such a model or similar models or models in general advise on policy making. So considering all the complexity that you were referring to yourself, and also what we got to in the Q&A a little bit, to what extent do you think that a model could advise policy? That's a general question. And more specifically, perhaps, or more generally, I'm sorry, when would a model be trustworthy and should be considered for advising policy? Are there ways of looking at a model and assessing their, let's call it, trustworthiness?
That's a very good and deep question. So in my, in my personal, my personal opinion is that with the best of the best working on this, for instance, if we go back to, let us go back to the author list. Of course, its numbers is not everything, but let's go. Okay, this is like 20 authors, and these people are from a variety of fields. This is state of the art of whatever it is that's out there. Still, I mean, if you look at the head of modeling, let's say the how do you call that? CMO, Chief Modeling Officer of RIVM, that's Jacco Wallinga. He says, we cannot predict more than 1 month ahead with the models. It's impossible. Look at the weather, right? How much ahead can you predict the weather? 1 week, 2 weeks? Still, I mean, it's the only thing you got, right? So I still think that, I mean, the discussion of the trustworthiness is a very important one. And it's related to this whole predictability discussion that also comes with the complexity. So I think it's a difficult one. But I still think that it has a lot of value in decision making. Because even though I mean, it's not maybe 100% sure, but at least you have all these statistical methods to show that at least it's a very high probability that in a certain range something will happen, and this is basically the best you can get.
Right.
I don't think there's a silver bullet here.
Absolutely right. I think it's also important to realize that models are getting adjusted based on new data coming in. And the next question is actually about new data that might be generated shortly, because one of the things that is being considered is using the tracing app as one of the sort of alternatives for the rollout scenarios. And the question is, the tracing apps would be put in place. Let's assume that the privacy issues that are associated with them are taken care of. And we could have one way or the other, those tracing apps. Would those data help you sort of make your model more accurate in terms of future predictions?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the big problem with these models is information that you need to make the model more accurate. In fact, it's interesting, eh? So this Neil Ferguson, he made the following remark. So in fact, the screen you see in front of you now. So this for me, this was the most, in a sense, the most impactful report during this whole crisis. And he used both agent-based models and equation-based models. And he based his model on a prior model that he used in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. That was, I think, the avian flu or something. And that he fitted with data from Thailand. And Ferguson said, listen, getting the data in Thailand about the population behavior was much, much, much more difficult than coding. Coding is simple. I need the data. So the more data you have, the more accurate your model, the better you can predict, for sure. I mean, I'm not talking about the whole privacy discussion here, which is also very relevant, but more data, better model, for sure.
Very good, excellent. One last specific question about actually how the model predicts the differences between different provinces and regions. The question is whether the model accounts for the heterogeneity of the populations in different areas. For instance, in some areas are more locals were living and other areas are more expats living. To what extent does the model account for that? And the fact that different people move around differently and might have different impacts.
I love this question. So thank you for whoever you are that posted. So one of the things in Escape that we want to do is, of course, bring together these approaches and do it in a network setting. But here, network does not only mean a spatial network in provinces, but also in age cohorts, so different population groups, because this is, of course, also very homogeneous, right? Heterogeneous. So people of a certain age mix with, well, basically maybe mix with people of their own age and not so much with people who are 20 years younger or 10 years older. So yes, we also want to take that into account. So as you can see, the model will become more and more and more heterogeneous and more complicated. So we will need more and more data.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Rob, for now. I think we could wrap up this part of the Q&A and go to the second presentation. Of course, we'll come back to the general round of Q&A at the end of the webinar.
Great, thank you.
Now. Okay, and apologies, by the way, that I did not introduce you in the beginning of the presentation properly. So it's a little bit late for that, but let me just again emphasize that Rob is a professor of network architecture and services at TU Delft, and he has worked in Singapore and many other places and has come back to TU Delft in 2018. The next speaker is Professor Tina Comas, who is an associate professor at Delft University, but also a full professor at University of Agder in Norway. She is also a senior research fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and she also serves as a scientific co-director of the 4TU Center on Resilience Engineering. And Tina is going to speak with us, and let me actually give you the floor. So I think if the sound is on and working, without further ado, I would like to give you the floor, Professor Comas.
Yeah, thanks. It was also, yeah, thanks for the nice introduction, and also thanks for the opportunity to give me the floor to comment a bit on what Rob has just said. From a perspective of like my background is also I studied mathematics once upon a time, and then I moved into researching decision making in very complex situations that are prone to time pressure. So I've been looking at decision making in disasters, and specifically also on how people make decisions if their decisions have serious long-term consequences, but they need to make them very rapidly. So today I'm going to speak about uncertainty in behavioral models in the context of a European project that is called HEROES. Now, this first slide is to tell you how volatile the situation is. The EU had a call out for rapid proposals when COVID-19 was largely in China, and we submitted that proposal somewhere in mid-February, I think on the 10th or 11th, and you could see like we were constantly updating when we were writing it the number of infections. And yet it says there, you know, by beginning of February, the number of affected people surpasses 42,000. Probably now we would, not laugh about it, but it shows you how dynamic that was. And mind you, that's just a couple of months ago. It feels like an era to many of us, but there are reasons for that. Now, what we are doing in this project is similar to what Rob was talking about. So I'm very happy that you know you already outlined what the mathematical part is about. So we are looking at how epidemics spread through contact networks. We know that COVID is largely passed on from person to person. So we basically need to understand how people interact. And to model that, we also use an agent-based model. And that's basically a model that allows to capture interaction between different agents. That can be people, it can be households, it can be other entities. And try to understand how from that the infectious behavior evolves. And that we will couple with a network model that is based on system dynamics. That's what Rob called equation-based. So you see here also a classic representation of this susceptible, infected, recovered, or diseased model. So that's what we are going to do within the context of the project. Now you can definitely ask yourself, how far is that different than from what Rob has just said? Now, remember the presentation of the provinces and all the nodes in the network. Now, of course, you can ask yourself if that is an adequate representation, looking at a node and then the interactions between that of a city. And of course, you can understand different things with this representation. But if we also want to drill deeper into the implications for different parts of the population, into the implications for equality, inequality, into what infections mean, then we have to get closer to understanding behavior and definitely behavioral change. So how do we normally go about that? Understanding behavioral change is, of course, research. For instance, in economics research, there's a lot of literature on nudging, how to make people change their behavior, you know, live more healthily, cycle, and so forth. So that's what we know. Normally, you can say there are three large factors to understand behavioral change: personal, individual, that's your beliefs, knowledge, attitudes. So that is really what is personally coming from you. Then there's social. We all have probably experienced now in the lockdown more than ever before that we are very social people, so respond to what others do. And then the environmental factors. So typically, economy, you will say that, for instance, there are price shocks to which people react. There are new technologies that allow us to hold webinars. But now, of course, we are in a phase where we see a huge pandemic, which is an incredible external shock. And that obviously changes our social interactions. For many, drastically changes the way we interact and cuts the network down. And it also may change, our attitudes, our beliefs, our knowledge, our experience. Like what we see now, like many of us thought that was unthinkable. Like people have warned for such a pandemic, but it was just not in the mental framework of many people. But now all of a sudden things are possible that were unthinkable just really a couple of weeks ago. Now, in terms of theory, there are two major theories that we can look at to understand these effects and how frameworks to understand these behavioral shifts. One is social cognitive theory. So that is basically what is underlying these social interactions, saying that we are social animals, observe and learn a lot from others. So capturing these positive and negative reinforcement effects, and that's where agent-based models are very good in capturing. And then there is also quite old already, very established, I should say, theory of planned behavior, where basically people's behavior is determined by intention, prediction of attitudes, subjective norms, and beliefs. And of course, that normally works quite well. Rob already said it. If you have a lot of data, if you do a lot of surveys about what people think and how they behave or don't behave. But this COVID pandemic is a drastic shock. And just to illustrate that, some data from the US, that's a dashboard that's called SafeGraph, that collects a lot of data about behavior and how it changed through access of points of interest. So that's, I just selected California. You can also go there and play around a couple of data sets. So what you can see there is basically how foot travel changed sorry, through the past couple of months. But what is also really interesting is the right part of the graph. So you can see here how specific points of interest were frequented here still normal, and then it really fell off in California probably a bit later than in other places. And you can also see that for the supermarkets, the big malls and shops, there was actually a spike where people were preparing for the lockdown, but it's still relatively high, relatively at normal level, whereas movie theaters, shopping malls really fell down. So that's what we have at a state level. But we also know, that's what I said in the beginning, that the lockdown has very different implications for different parts of the population. So this is a study from Germany that looked at who actually can work from home and how did the work time change. And you see that most of us are probably in a very privileged situation of having higher education, which basically means we are better off because we can work from home and our work time, for the better or the worse, did not change very much. But if you already have lower education, a different job, that's the people that still need to go to their workplace and at the same time have the more drastic cuts and reduction of work time. So to understand this, what we will do is understanding behavior of different profiles and groups in a city. And that's work to illustrate that, I'm showing you some older work from the postdoc, Michael, who is working with me on that HEROES project. Because as Rob said, it's really difficult to collect and get good data to come up with models that are so fine-grained. That's why we are not at that level yet, but I wanted to illustrate it to you. So what we will try to do is develop some profiles based on statistical data that we get, and have different sort of statistical profiles for households, and look at, for instance, how they are moving about in a city and where they would be located. And that allows us to break a city down into different segments where different parts of the population are represented in one way or another. And then we can also draw conclusions on the behavior and on the movements, for instance, we observe from there. So far, very much in a nutshell. So that's what we are going to do. Now, challenges. Obviously, data, that was already mentioned. Now, in that project, we are also looking beyond the Netherlands. What you just saw was The Hague. Sure, you've recognized that. So the initial intention of that European project was, remember, we wrote it when the outbreak was still primarily in China, to work with some NGOs, humanitarian organizations that are active in China, to get data from there. However, my Chinese is still not up to speed, but it's really, really difficult to get good data at that granular level from there. Other, like European cities, it's a lot better. There's a lot of open data, and yeah, we can really try to understand these gaps. But as we are trying to do a model that's okay, that's working well for several cities, and where we can understand different cultural settings, backgrounds, also the impact of different policies and lockdown strategies, that is really a massive challenge. And then, of course, what was already alluded to before is that predictions during such a pandemic, which constitutes a fundamental shift of the behavior, is really, really difficult, because we don't know anymore what is normal. What is the baseline? What are we converging to? How do we deal with all that volatility? So Rob was already saying, yeah, we can predict like small snippets, but of course the political decisions that are now being made will have implications for a longer term in the future. And we really don't have established models to deal with that. One example to illustrate that was just in the MIT review. Normally Amazon is the gold standard of supply chain optimization, but actually it says this sort of weird behavior is even messing with the AI that tries to predict consumer behavior. So the situation is so volatile, you're trying to optimize for toilet paper last week, and this week everybody wants to buy puzzles or gym equipment. So these drastic shifts are such that they are outside of what even AI is calibrated for, and these models have to adapt it and constantly be adjusted and readjusted. And this also shows you here in the right corner how people started with the onset of the response to all of a sudden search for face masks, hand sanitizers, disinfectant, and so forth. So these huge spikes that were not part of any normal supply chain models. And so we have to go from a phase where we used to work with just minor fluctuations to massive spikes. Now, how do we do that? Of course, this global pandemic is unprecedented. Actually, so unprecedented that even the use of the word unprecedented apparently spikes. But there's been a lot of researches on decision making in disasters, and one of my favorite papers on that is actually called "Believe in the Model, Mishandle the Emergency." And it, of course, makes the point that these models and predictions are extremely valuable, but at the same time, it comes with a note of caution that there are many pitfalls in how these models can and should be used. So first of all, we can have a nice debate on all the uncertainties that are associated with the models, on sensitivity analysis, on how the model is set up, on whether or not the Neil Ferguson's model was actually right, and what does it mean if that doesn't produce the same output if different people run it. But if it's used for policymaking, these policymakers need to understand whether or not that is of predictive quality, or whether it is just what was called a toy model, if it is reliable, if it has some sort of a note of caution to it, if you want to explore sort of a benchmark or a worst case scenario. And the risk here is that if these uncertainties are underestimated or not acknowledged properly, then assumptions and predictions need to be revised in a way that unsettles the public, makes it lose trust, and that's what you can, I mean, we are already in a situation where there's a lot of radicalization, fragmentation, these demonstration everywhere. And it's definitely very important to communicate properly what we can and cannot do with the models through the whole chain. And then, of course, secondly, the output from these models form an extremely valuable input to decision-making, policy-making, but only one such input. And that is precisely because we know they are extremely uncertain, and we can help explore some things or look a couple of weeks ahead. But policymakers need to make decisions, the big bailouts that will have impacts for decades. So model can help looking ahead, and maybe a big ahead or a longer time ahead, but it is not a replacement for political decision making. So there's also a big debate that is of course currently going on to like how far should you base decisions on science. And another question that belongs to that is also, what can science actually tell you? A framework to think of that is the Cynefin framework. I probably pronounced it again wrong. It's actually Welsh. So that has come up with this classification about what we can know, what is knowable, the complex and the chaotic realms. And this is a useful classification to start thinking about the situation and discuss this knowability. What we are going to do is to do some exploratory analysis on it. And Behnam already shows up. That means it's time for me to finish. I'm also done. Yeah.
You can take a few more minutes to finish, to wrap up if you want.
No, well, so that's just also, if you are interested in what we are doing in this project, I would like to get in touch, please do. But yeah.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tina, for the very nice presentation. So a question has come in the previous round, actually, that was asked regarding Rob's approach and model, but I think the question would equally relate to what you are talking to here in your presentation. In Rob's model, I think geography was one of the important nodes taken into account for modeling. In your model, you are still using geography, and I'm not sure if I may use the term, but I'm going to say it, and correct me if I'm using the wrong term, but the resolution of your model was differently, because you were looking at not only the cities or the regions, but looking at communities within actually a city, the city of The Hague, you showed us. A question is that how would the model change if you do not actually take geography as a node, but a community itself, and make assumptions regarding, for instance, as the question says, a whole school that might travel, for instance, and affect public transport of specific groups of people that you were referring to also in your presentation. So not taking geography per se into account, but actually taking different nodes into the model. Would that change the predictions and the anticipations?
No. So what we are trying to do with the model, is of course it's a spatially explicit model. So that means you have in the model the networks as they are situated in space. So of course that means we are trying to look at the different communities and how they are interacting. So there is a network that is underlying that, but of course the spatial component allows you to see where this transmission takes place and how it then grows or retracts, where you have hotspots within a city, which is actually important for policymakers. Like we are, for instance, in touch with the municipality of The Hague. Of course, they are interested in where they need to watch out, but at the same time, of course, there are. If we look at what is happening, for instance, at the schools or around the schools, we use just the spatial representation of the network. What you also said was the school traveling, or the group from Groningen going skiing or something like that. That is another challenge for the predictability, that we are seeing now, so the numbers have gone down, and we see that the impact of these so-called super spreading events gets bigger. And that is exactly, you know, one person who was sick going in South Korea on a club, infecting many different people. There was a choir that was rehearsing in the US somewhere, where all the 60 people or so got infected. So that is becoming more and more important, and is really difficult because it is not, you know, your normal behavior of attending a choir, or not sure how regularly most of you go clubbing. But that then becomes really difficult to capture.
Of course. Another question is regarding how to acquire data. Again, in both models, we very much depend on the data, valid data that comes in. And the question is there a way to actually acquire data in such models, taking into account, for instance, privacy issues that very much matter? Should we take data into account that Google already collects from a lot of us, or other apps and companies like Facebook that also do a lot of tracking of their users? Is it a legitimate way of actually using the data, or would you as a researcher be troubled by actually acquiring the data without the consent of those users?
Yeah. So yes, that's the short. I mean, I would have a lot of trouble with collecting data without any consent of the users. That's also why, you know, we said we have so much problems working with China and Chinese data, because the data is available to the government, but it's not out in the open. And the other example, Helsinki, I spared you the Finnish website. I still think that Finnish and Chinese are sort of at the same level of complexity and difficulty to understand it. But what you see for Helsinki, that list there, that's all public and open data. So that is something that the cities, and actually Finland is a very country where there's a lot of open data, that is publicly available. So we make use of that public data. Same for the Netherlands, and same for Italy, where a lot of that is shared. And at the same time there, we also work with microdata. So that's microcensus data that we get from Eurostat. But of course, it makes it a lot more difficult to work through that level. And that is exactly why I don't have the results yet of the models, because we are like not knee deep, but like hip deep, wading in the data and trying to work with what we actually can get. And yeah, obviously, if I had, I showed you also that safe graph picture from the US, that definitely would make it easier. But that's I think collected from a panel and people who can download the app, but we don't have it for Europe.
Thanks very much. Another question is actually about the risk-taking behavior. So there is a lot of discussion going on about how people take risk and how they actually sort of perceive after a certain risk. And an important discussion or important example here could be that, for instance, Prime Minister Rutte assumes that wearing masks is not necessarily going to actually reduce the risks, because on the one hand, it does reduce the physical spread of the virus. But he assumes that people will behave differently because they would assume a certain safety, and by that actually get much closer to each other, which could be the beginning of a lot of problems. So could these models, one way or the other, actually account for these issues, for the risk-taking behavior and how people might respond to something that ensures safety to an extent?
Yeah. So in principle, so the models could, if we get the data, and that is sort of the general problem. We didn't try it out yet. So of course we could run surveys and ask a lot of people, like, yeah, if you are now wearing a mask, then would you still like keep your distance or try to keep your distance? But what people tell you that they do is often different from what they actually do. So that's one of the problem, and then of course, yeah, we also see some fluctuations over time. So maybe in the initial, say, week or 2 weeks, you still take your distance, but then, you know, you go to the supermarket, you haven't been infected, you go to work, you haven't been infected, and then over time, it sort of loses its threat potential, and you get less cautious. That's an assumption that you can make and of course put into a model, but we don't have the data. And that's why, you know, what we are going to do with these models is explore different sort of scenarios that are more fundamentally different than small variations. Really try out what happens if, and use that to give these scenarios to decision makers and policy makers so that they can make a better informed choice. But you know, it's hard to predict how people will react because it's such a different world.
I
That's
think
not
you
an easy
mentioned that.
answer. I know.
No, absolutely, but it's a very much understandable answer. And I think this would be a good moment to also ask Rob to join us. The next question might be of interest to the two of you. And I think, you know, you alluded to this yourself in your presentation, that there are some people who say because of the uncertainties and the difficulties with prediction and the complexities, perhaps those models are not the best way on deciding how to act in the future. At the same time, one might ask, if not science and the scientific models, what should be actually the lead, take the lead and help us in steering future policy? So the question for the two of you, should we just not acknowledge, as one of the attendees asking, acknowledge that the models are incapable of predicting future behavior? And if they are not, how can we actually use the model in a proper way to still help us one way or the other?
Yeah. I didn't say not, I said they are, or I said they should not be the only thing. You know, because they can support decision and are a tool to explore different sort of scenarios that are based on different assumptions. You know, so if at some point a policymaker came and would say, okay, I assume that this is my population, that this is the infection, that these are the interaction rates, then of course the model could make a perfect prediction. You saw Rob's initial models, these what you call toy models. Now that is what we can do with these models. If we have a lot more uncertainty to take into account, and also long-term implications that are not just of epidemiological nature. I talked a bit about inequality. I talked a bit about possible radicalization, and the social dynamics and the social implications behind that. This is, you know, way beyond an epidemiological model, but something that policymakers, I would hope, need to factor in. That's also what they are elected for. So there are answers that we can provide from science, from social science, through modeling. But of course, like, we can't make decisions for a prime minister.
So you would say models as the beginning of the public debate and not in the end station, giving the final definitive answers per se.
No, models to help explore the implications of some, you know, scenarios, of some assumptions. Different models can be used also for different parts of the picture. There's also a lot of great research, for instance, on perceptions, on how the population feels, on how sentiment goes. But all of that somehow has to be brought together to some policy advice, and the full picture has to be considered.
Right. Rob, how do you see
Okay.
actually the role of models considering the critique that is there?
Yes, well, I completely agree with Tina that, of course, this is not the only approach. It's just one of maybe many approaches. I still think that currently with the technology of let's say the computational technology, it is still possible by combining all these different types of expertise in different types of models, at least to sort of cover a very broad range of future scenarios. And I think it's good to think about it and more or less get some experience what these scenarios would look like. And there's one thing I would like to bring to the attention. So there's a thing called serious gaming. So there you can bring a number of people together and you play out a number of these scenarios, and that is really a very interesting tool, such that people get a better perception of what might happen in the future. Of course, it's impossible. Well, it's possible to predict the future, but it's basically impossible to do it right? But even getting a feeling of what might be waiting for us, and in some cases it's not a big problem. In some cases, if I make the wrong prediction, especially if it's a very worst case prediction, that at least we're we're ready for, let's say, a very worst case situation. If we can manage it, it's still okay. I mean, better safe than sorry, I would say. So one thing in the discussion, I think it's important again to stress that it's not only mathematicians that come up with the models. It should be social scientists, data scientists, people from virology, psychology, everything. I also see platforms where people call in for the help of artists. I think that's a great idea, because it stimulates the imagination. And where are we? This is such a big thing in all our lives. So I think it's good to think of a platform that's very broad. Everybody can join. That's good.
I think
yes.
Please go ahead.
Go ahead, Tina.
Just one remark with these predictions and sort of implementing a precautionary principle. Seen a bit of that in the Ebola response, where initially there was a lot of that was lingering in the countries. Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, was saying, but you know, this is about to explode. The international community has to do something about it. Then it started to explode, and then there were some initial predictions that were relatively extreme, like 1 million, 2 million people that fatalities dying from Ebola. That, of course, then the response kicked in, and for Ebola there were also some more behavioral measures that were easier to implement than for COVID, and that's why it didn't. It then, you know, floated down, and there were never these 2 million people dying from it, thankfully. But then we spoke to decision makers, like in the late fall, winter 2014, 2015, and they basically said, yeah, but these models were totally wrong. So how can we still use and work with predictions? And that's that educational component in there, that this model fulfilled a very solid purpose. I think that was also the argument that Rob was making for Neil Ferguson's model, that sort of really tried to alert the government and saying, look, if you don't take action, then this is what could happen. Right. That's still a different thing from when people hear this is what will happen.
Yeah, of course.
And that's sort of really a difficult.
I agree.
A difficult aspect also of science communication and science policies.
Exactly. Yes.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Apologies. Excellent. I think what Rob was referring to in terms of actually also engaging artists in understanding and also comprehending the larger questions with the pandemics very much goes to the spirit of the idea behind also this webinar. That's in order to understand the large societal questions, we need transdisciplinary approaches, which is not only interdisciplinary and understanding the different disciplines, as the two of you are emphasizing in your presentations, but also reaching out to non-academic stakeholders, and artists might play a role. I have also seen very interesting approaches there. Another question that is there is regarding, and I'm making an assumption here, and correct me if the assumption is wrong, so the question wouldn't be valid. But my assumption is that a lot of these models that I have seen, also in your presentations, but also elsewhere, are assuming sort of national behavior. We are trying to assess at the national level how things will change in a post-lockdown situation. And we know that right now in Europe, there is a lot of discussion going on regarding the extent to which we could bring back tourism, because a large portion of European economy is depending on that. So there is a serious talk going on regarding how we could actually sort of loosen some restrictions there and allow for that. And my question would be, do these models and can these models account for transboundary movements? And because right now we are assuming that the transport between the provinces and between the cities and between the neighborhoods within a city, what if in a month we will be traveling between countries again?
Well, from my perspective, yes. And why is the answer yes? By the way, I think the assumption that you made in the beginning was valid. So it's a valid question, I think. Yes, we are looking at the network perspective. And the way I defined the network was by showing you an example of how we look at the evolution of the virus in the Netherlands. But a node could be anything. It could be a country, or it could be a continent. Of course, again, if I look at the continents, then it's very aggregated. If I look at cities or municipalities or even villages, then granularity changes. But generically, it's the same model. So sure, we can do that. I mean, that's one of the proposals we make in our one of the propositions we make in the project proposal Escape. We will first use data from the Netherlands, and that includes movement between provinces, but then we want to scale first to other countries, maybe where a lot of data is available. It seems that Finland might be interesting, and then we can scale to country levels. So yeah, sure, that's at least part of our, that's why I stressed the network aspect. And yeah. Movement of people is just movement in a network. Well, it's complicated, of course, but I mean, methodologically.
And normally we have a lot of really good data on that. So like there is the initial outbreak of COVID was predicted, I think, by a Canadian artificial intelligence company that scraped all these reports from Chinese newspapers and then combined that information with the information that Chinese New Year was coming up. And they predicted a huge spread because they were combining like outbreak with this network and travel information. So that normally is at that level getting possible again, and also what we intend to do. So zooming in at the sort of city level and then see how cities connect, and then cities of course don't only connect within country.
Tina,
can I add something to that? Can I add something to that? And the first, the SARS outbreak, which was in 2003, so which was actually SARS-CoV-1. This virus is called SARS-CoV-2. But afterwards, there were a lot of studies based on air transport routes. So let's say the travel flows of people taking airplanes. And it was very, very useful to follow the let's say the course of the outbreak of SARS. So yes, it's something that is being used a lot, and possible to do.
Excellent. In assuming actually or predicting social behavior, the fact that people might travel across countries in case of tourism and trying to anticipate that social behavior, does that add a huge layer of complexity to a model like the one that you were presenting, Tina? Taking into account that the customs and approaches might be different in different countries, the perception of risk might be different in different countries, etc.
Yeah. So basically, it means that you have to model the different countries. It's always easier if you like I had this very sort of naive representation of a blob where I said, is this a city? You could also say a blob is a country. So if I, just try to represent behavior within the city and then show how it spreads from there into other countries, that's of course, that's one step. So I sort of get the what tourists bring to other regions of Europe or the world, but then to understand how it spreads within the country, and exactly taking into account what you just said, the different behaviors, the different policies that are in place, the different norms. That of course means then you have to bring it again down to that lower level, which means you have to really model the different behaviors. So it's sort of a similar approach, but then again, the crux lies really in understanding behavior in place, and behavior is, in some parts of the world, definitely very different. Like, also probably Finland is different from the Netherlands. Finland is becoming the ideal case. And there are, even within the Scandinavian countries, everybody's talking about Sweden. That's very different from the other ones. That means you have to have these data sets and these models in all these places if you want to do it at that level. If not, you can do it at a higher aggregation level.
Excellent. What might also be the case is the different perceptions of actually scientific authority in different countries, which might be different in North Europe than elsewhere in Europe and in the world. I would like to thank both speakers very, very much for being with us for their fascinating talks. Before wrapping up this session, I want to repeat that Paul van Gent's simulation and his link to his website will be on our website of the Institute. Also, the presentations of both speakers and the webinar, as it has been actually recorded right now, will be there, so you could watch back or refer others to the webinar session if you like. and that would be on www.delftsafetyandsecurity.nl. Again, I would like to thank Tina and Rob for being with us, and also thank Eveline Vrede, who has done a lot to facilitate this session. Thanks very much, Eveline, too. We will have a few more sessions of webinars in this series coming up from the Delft Safety and Security Institute. You could leave your email address with us, and we will reach out and send you the announcement and the invitation for the next webinar. Thank you both for being with us, and have a great day.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
And thanks for organizing.